So, Andrew, sometimes I feel it's a mixed emotion because I want to know, but at the same time, I still want to so.
Phone's off. Good morning, everyone. My name is Soji Malatsi. I'm the party's Parliamentary Media Whip and National Spokesperson. I'm joined by Dion George, who's our Shadow Minister for Finance, and Ma'am Bridget Masango, who's our Shadow Minister for Social Development, and Ashor Sarupen, who's Dion George's Deputy on the Portfolio of Finance. As you are aware, around this time in the lead up to the Minister of Finance budget speech, the DA always tables our alternative budget. This budget will primarily focus on our plans to grow the economy, to keep the lights on and cut the cost of food, which is something that we have consistently driven throughout the previous parliamentary term. It's going to be a very substantive and detailed document, so I'd like to plead for your patience with that. Dion will take us through the first section, and then Ashor will also expand on the details that are in the alternative budget that we're presenting, and Ma'am Bridget Masango's focus will basically be on the impact that it has been having on vulnerable South Africans, and thereafter we will take the Q&A as we always do. So Dion, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sally, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. On Wednesday, the Minister of Finance, Enoch, Godongwana, will deliver the 2023 national budget. Government must focus on measures to stimulate economic growth and create an environment that is attractive to domestic and foreign investment. Previous budgets have consistently failed, and all South Africans are getting poorer in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Households are battling to put enough food on their tables. Unemployment continues to rise as business bears the brunt of increasing electricity blackouts, and rapidly increasing debt is crowding out more and more basic service delivery. The impact of a likely grey listing by the Financial Action Task Force later this week will be an immediate increase in the cost of compliance for South African financial institutions, and this will knock on to already hard-pressed consumers. The Democratic Alliance has formulated an alternative budget proposal to revitalise the economy and bring relief to battling households. The DA's 2023 alternative budget proposal is founded on our comprehensive economic policy that will deliver an enterprising economy that can halve unemployment by 2030. The implementation of responsible fiscal management practices, as proposed by the DA, enables more economic and labour market participation, a reduction in public debt, an attraction of foreign and domestic investment, and an improvement in living standards, and the alleviation of the disproportionate impact of rising inflationary pressures on vulnerable members of society. Major reforms are required for South Africa to thrive economically. This starts by removing government-imposed barriers to growth. A government that is effective at serving the public limits regulation and focuses on essential services. This is what will create a dynamic, enterprising economy with market forces and individual freedom at the forefront. This year's alternative budget incorporates these fundamental principles and constitutes a progression of the Democratic Alliance Alternative Medium-Term Budget Policy Statement of October 2022. The policy imperatives of the alternative budget include establishing a foundation for sustainable economic growth, boosting the energy sector and providing pragmatic solutions to rolling blackouts, stabilizing the fiscal environment and reducing public debt, supporting vulnerable South Africans, and bolstering corruption-busting institutions. The current economic climate, characterized by rampant inflation, influenced by fluctuating local and international conditions, and the severe negative impact of unreliable energy supply, presents significant hurdles in meeting these expectations. To address these obstacles, a comprehensive approach is necessary, which prioritizes fiscal sustainability from the outset, which must be achieved through economic growth by introducing debt reduction measures and careful expenditure management. Additionally, it is important to balance the provision of support to vulnerable members of society with addressing deficiencies in service delivery while avoiding tax increases. It is crucial to strengthen institutions that combat corruption and organized crime. These institutions have been hollowed out and need to be strengthened to ensure South Africa can exit the grey list as soon as possible. Global growth is expected to decelerate sharply to 1.7% in 2023, the third weakest pace of growth in nearly 3 decades, overshadowed only by the global recession caused by the pandemic and the global financial crisis. The projection is 1.3% below forecast made in 2022 and reflects a worsening financial climate worldwide. Governments are responding to contain very high inflation and the continued disruptions from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. South Africa's economic contraction of minus 6.4% in 2020 was one of the largest in the developing world, and our recovery is amongst the slowest. Our economic activity still lags behind emerging market counterparts, and the South African economy narrowly avoided a technical economic recession in the latter half of 2022. South Africa is not resilient in the face of international geopolitical uncertainties, as demonstrated by the country's disappointing economic performance across multiple fronts. In fact, South Africa is the lagging factor for Southern Africa's economic growth, as our fiscal environment remains characterized by an unsustainable level of debt, persistent deficit spending, slow economic growth, stubbornly high levels of unemployment, a deceleration of both foreign and domestic private capital formation, a decline in GDP per capita, escalating living costs, and potential food insecurity and political volatility. These circumstances are compounded by factors that fall under government purview, such as uncertain private property rights, onerous labour market legislation, inadequate national and local governance, and a large and inefficient public sector dominated by monopolistic state-owned enterprises. Without deregulating the rigid policy environment which inhibits economic activity, building economic resilience will not be attainable. Inflation will continue to surge, the rate of unemployment will continue to spiral upwards, and economic growth will remain meagre, if at all positive. As a developing country with growing workforce, South Africa should be experiencing sustained positive economic growth. If the country were to implement the policy reforms proposed by the DA in its 2023 alternative budget, it is possible that South Africa realize economic growth rates comparable to our emerging market counterparts and the 3.4 growth projection made by the World Bank. Projections in this alternative budget rest on this assumption. Attracting foreign capital is crucial for promoting local economic growth. However, stringent policies have restricted foreign investors in establishing successful business in South Africa, as evidenced by a downward trajectory of foreign direct investment inflows into South Africa, which have fallen by 39% between 2016 and 2020. The DA will attract foreign capital to stimulate local economic growth through market liberalization, property rights enhancement, trade openness, regulatory streamlining and cutting red tape, private sector development, and scrapping exchange controls. Encouraging domestic saving for investment is crucial for promoting economic freedom, efficiency, and growth. This can be done through the following measures. Implement the DA's macroeconomic framework, which is a stable macroeconomic environment with low inflation, predictable monetary policy, and sound fiscal management, creates a favorable environment for saving and investment. Promoting market efficiency by reducing barriers to entry, promoting competition, and ensuring property rights, the DA encourages the efficient allocation of resources and promotes saving. Tax incentives. The government must provide tax incentives for individuals to save, such as tax-free interest on savings accounts and higher limits on tax-free saving. The DA proposes raising the threshold on taxes on interest earned to 500,000 Rand and increasing the annual tax-free savings limit to 100,000 Rand. The continuous bailouts provided to state-owned enterprises have failed to stimulate the corporate revitalization and growth necessary across the underperformance and financial struggles of these entities. Instead, these fiscal interventions on the part of government have largely been used to finance debt servicing, excessive wage bills, and inflated spending on suppliers, resulting in negative rates of return for the economy. The recurrent bailouts have crowded out infrastructure investment and confirmed that government has no intention of implementing structural economic reform. This is reinforced by the lack of incentives to encourage responsible fiscal management on the part of state-owned enterprises, as the taxpayer carries the burden of inefficient management, not the entity itself. The lack of urgency in addressing the structural issues plaguing SOEs raises questions about the motivations behind the provision of these bailouts. The state-owned enterprises operate as crony patronage networks. Failure to act now by opening the sector to private sector investment will keep the economy locked in an indefinite low growth trap and will hamper any attempt to stabilize the economy. President Ramaphosa's recent proposal for a state holding company to centralize South Africa's commercial state-owned enterprises is a desperate attempt at keeping unviable entities alive. The Democratic Alliance vehemently opposes it, as it will serve as a vehicle for ANC cadre deployment and patronage rather than addressing the systemic issues plaguing the SOE sector. Given the severity of financial mismanagement of most SOEs, private sector participation is vital. The President's proposed SOE holding company runs counter to this trend, and the DA calls for its rejection. The government must privatize state-owned assets. However, the divestiture and privatization of state-owned assets has been a long-standing complexity for governments, despite the fact that the estimated value of public sector assets exceeds twice global GDP, as reported by the International Monetary Fund. The process of divesting these assets has been marred by issues of cronyism and suboptimal financial returns. The Ukrainian pro-Zorro sale model is an example of what is possible. It represents a pioneering and easily replicable approach to realizing the financial potential of state-owned assets that would enable government to sell its assets through an online bidding platform. Determining the value of an asset is generally a difficult and complex process for governments. The pro-Zorro sale auction system allows for market-based pricing. The system's unique design, characterized by transparency, open and fair bidding, allows government agencies to efficiently monetize assets that have traditionally been difficult or inefficient to trade. This has led to improved trust and participation in the market, appropriately established prices, and increased market size, fairness, and efficiency. By incorporating a similar model, government land, buildings, and businesses that have been neglected by the South African government for years can get a chance to start anew, while the state would be able to generate funds and get rid of idle assets that deliver negative rates of return. South Africa's worst performing state-owned enterprises such as Prasa, Transnet and Denel must be the first entities to sell their worst performing assets through the proposed system. The South African economy is constrained by the deteriorating state of its public infrastructure, as evidenced by the D rating assigned to the country by the South African Institute of Civil Engineers on its infrastructure condition scorecard. The scorecard, which uses a five-point scale, evaluated 32 subsectors of infrastructure and found that the current condition and performance of South African infrastructure network poses a significant risk of failure. Addressing the issues of South Africa's crumbling infrastructure must therefore be a priority for policymakers, as well-maintained infrastructure is crucial for promoting economic growth, revenue generation, and international competitiveness. The DA proposes that development bonds, also known as impact bonds, are a solution to the problem facing South Africa's deteriorating infrastructure. These bonds are financial instruments that are issued by government or public entities to raise funds for long-term projects aimed at promoting economic and social development. The funds raised from the sale of these bonds are typically used for infrastructure projects such as building roads, bridges, and hospitals, and for financing social programs such as education and healthcare. The involvement of the private sector in funding developmental bonds helps to spur economic growth and development by providing a source of financing for essential projects and initiatives that cannot be fully supported by the public sector. In addition, the private sector can bring expertise, efficiency, and innovative solutions to these projects, helping to ensure their success. The number of employed people dropped from 16.3 million in 2019 to 14.1 million in 2020, essentially wiping out more than a decade's progress on job creation. By the third quarter of 2022, the number of people with jobs had only recovered to 15.8 million, still below the level of 16.3 million recorded in pre-COVID 2019. Poor labour policy choices have trapped millions in unemployment. South Africa needs fundamental change to the primary impediments of labour market efficiency. The DA will scrap all race-based legislation that has distorted the labour market and cadre deployment practices, and embrace a labour legislature framework that pursues non-racialism through true economic empowerment of all South African citizens. South Africa must establish a two-track approach to regulation, labour law and tax policy that reflects the country's unique economic landscape and development priorities. On the one hand, large corporations, which drive the majority of research and development and exports, require a supportive regulatory environment that can help them to remain competitive in the global market. On the other hand, small and medium enterprises, which make up a significant portion of the country's employment, need a flexible and supportive policy environment that can encourage entrepreneurship and job creation. There were approximately 2.6 million operating small, medium, and micro enterprises across all industries in the country as of March 2022. The growth of the sector is therefore crucial for the country's economic survival. SMMEs, as the sector, generates 36% of South Africa's total output and employs up to 60% of the country's workers. Adopting a more supportive regulatory environment for small businesses will drive entrepreneurship, increase the number of startups, and create job opportunities. This can be achieved by fostering a transparent, predictable, and stable regulatory environment that reduces the burden on small businesses. The government must take a flexible approach towards small business regulation, recognizing their importance as drivers of job creation and economic growth. This should include the relaxation of labor regulations such as the minimum wage and working hour requirements, allowing small businesses to focus on their core operations without being encumbered by excessive regulation and taxes. Regulation should only be imposed when necessary for public health, safety, and welfare, and should be designed such as their impact on small businesses are minimized. These factors require a surrounding economic environment that is characterized by low cost compliance with regulations, low cost of transactions, reasonable transport costs, reasonable cost of living, reasonable availability of capital for small enterprises, local and national government that actually seeks to smooth the path of new enterprises and existing enterprises seeking to expand, and a transparent marketplace that isn't dominated by politically dominant cartels and subservient to cartels' government agencies. The tax regime for small firms need to be addressed to accelerate their growth. We propose the following interventions: to amend Section 12E of the present Income Tax Act to allow small businesses to deduct the cost of all capital equipment from their taxable incomes in the year in which the cost is paid, not just the cost of plant or machinery used in manufacturing. Raise the annual gross income ceiling for this capital equipment deduction from 20 million to 40 million. Raise the annual turnover ceiling, which qualifies a micro business for registration, from 1 million to 2 million. Increase from 500,000 to 1.2 million the minimum total remuneration paid by an employer to his employees before the skills development levy contributions become compulsory. The start of 2023 has seen more rolling blackouts than the start of any other year. The instability of the energy supply in conjunction with a tumultuous political climate has had a seriously detrimental effect on the advancement of South Africa, effectively halting the economic growth potential of our country. This situation not only hinders productivity but also undermines the confidence of investors, as the possibility of realizing a positive return on investment is impeded by recurrent power outages that are evidently politically induced. There has been a notable lack of action taken over the past 15 years to address the persistent scarcity of energy supply. Eskom is representative of the failure of centralized government and its inability to provide sustained energy supply, as rolling blackouts have estimated to cost the South African economy between 1.5 billion and 4 billion rand per day. The failing state-owned enterprise sector remains the greatest barricade to the realization of virtuous economic growth in South Africa. Even through the implementation of the DA's energy sector reforms, the delivery of sustainable energy supply may take up to 10 years. Based on this grim energy outlook, the DA reiterated its call for the privatization of Eskom and the opening up of the energy sector to independent power producers. In the interim, Eskom must prioritize the streamlining of its procurement processes while letting in massive private capacity to power a growing South Africa. By opening up the energy sector, innovation and voluntary action will keep the lights on and the wheels of the economy moving towards the growth rate needed to address declining economic participation. In his 2022 medium-term budget policy statement, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana announced that somewhere between 126 billion and 206 billion of Eskom's on-balance sheet debt will be reallocated from the entity's balance sheet onto the national sovereign debt profile. Given the already strained fiscus, transferring debt from SOEs to the national balance sheet remains a non-viable option. The DA will not support any offloading of Eskom's debt onto the country's sovereign balance sheet without a comprehensive plan to unbundle the entity and change its funding model. The orderly unbundling and restructuring of Eskom are critical requirements for achieving a well-diversified and competitive energy generation sector. This process must involve the formation of several independent generation companies, as well as the rationalization of the electricity distribution industry. Furthermore, the establishment of a competitive retail electricity sector comprising a diverse range of private sector entities with experience in wholesale procurement, innovative repackaging, marketing, and resale is also necessary to meet the diverse needs of domestic and commercial customers and various market segments. The remaining transmission entity of Eskom should become the future Eskom, this being a national state-owned independent transmission system and electricity market operator responsible for power planning, procurement, contracting, grid system, and electricity market operation. The DA's comprehensive energy proposals are set out in our energy policy. Eskom's unannounced implementation of a semi-permanent schedule of rolling blackouts, coupled with the potential for further deterioration, has prompted numerous South African consumers to explore the possibility of transitioning to off-grid systems through the installation of rooftop photovoltaic panels, incentivizing the adoption of rooftop solar technology by households and businesses can help mitigate the impact of ongoing blackouts. While it may not resolve significant capacity shortages, it can provide much needed relief at the domestic level. The Democratic Alliance has put forward the proposal for an emergency solar rebate program to incentivize the installation of solar systems at residential properties. The program, with a duration of 3 years, aims to address the current energy crisis and would operate as follows. Tax rebates in the form of a 100% deduction for the cost of installed solar equipment, along with other items that incentivize independence from Eskom, capped at 100,000 Rand. Participants would finance the upfront cost of installation and claim the deduction against taxable income during the submission of their annual returns. Furthermore, the DA will not support any expenditure related to the formation of the President's proposed Ministry of Electricity, nor will the DA support any expenditure resulting from the national state of disaster around Eskom. I will now hand over to Ashor to talk about debt.
Thank you very much, Dion. So as we all know, there is a positive correlation between economic growth and tax revenue, and this is fairly well established. So when you have a decline in economic growth, you're going to have a corresponding decrease in tax revenue. And by contrast, when you have increased economic growth, you will have increased tax revenue. This relationship, of course, is complicated by the fact that during downturns, government tax revenue will decrease, but the social wage will increase. This leads to budget deficits as government spending exceeds revenue. And we have seen this play out in South Africa for the last decade. To address this imbalance, governments usually resort to borrowing by issuing bonds and increasing deficit spending. But the accumulation of debt has negative consequences, such as raising the country's risk premium, as we've seen in the bond markets, and increasing the cost of servicing debt, which in turn constrains access to capital. This exacerbates the negative impact of low economic growth in South Africa and has created a self-perpetuating cycle of economic stagnation. The 2023 budget must therefore be anchored in a framework of fiscal prudence that prioritizes the reduction of the deficits, while also fostering economic growth and employment generation. Despite repeated efforts, national government has not been able to achieve its own fiscal targets over the last several years, which highlights the need for more comprehensive and cohesive approaches to budget management. Although zero-based budgeting has been under discussion for several years, there has been no progress in this regard. The South African government has implemented a redistributive policy framework, which has necessitated a significant increase in expenditure. To secure the funds necessary to finance this expenditure, the government has resorted to the accumulation of debt. However, it is imperative to note that the ability to repay a loan, including both the principal and interest, is contingent upon the borrower's capacity to generate income and wealth. Unfortunately, the government has been operating under the economic agenda of the ANC, which has demonstrated an inability to serve as a wealth generator. Instead, the state under the ANC's stewardship operates as a consumptive entity, continuously extracting resources from the wealth generators in society, namely individual workers and private sector businesses, and undermining the wealth generating capacity of the economy, and resulting in negative economic multipliers for state spending. Debt service costs have unfortunately become the fastest growing item of the budget, while consuming an increased share of GDP and revenue for the past 2 decades. Today, on average, 20 cents of every rand collected in revenue every year will be used to pay debt service costs. As a consequence, interest payments and accumulated debt have crowded out spending on essential public services such as policing, public health, and basic education, amongst others. This increase in debt and deficit spending did not result in increased spending on infrastructure and capital formation. Instead, it funded consumption spending. Government salaries, specifically the millionaire manager class, ballooned beyond what can be considered sustainable and justifiable, especially when one considers the lack of increased output, most notably in areas of social work, transport, and central government administration. So this past decade has seen a staggering rise in South Africa's public wage bill. Between the 2014 and 15 financial year and the 2019-20 financial year, civil service compensation grew above inflation at an average rate of 7.3% per annum. Between 2020-2021 financial year and the end of the MTEF period, it's projected to grow at 3.3% per year. The danger that double-digit inflation will become entrenched when wage settlements are above the Reserve Bank's target band is a very real risk. And once inflation expectations become de-anchored from the targets, only drastic policy steps will work. The DA therefore rejects the notion and will not increase wages by more than what is projected by the MTBPS. To reduce government spending, the Democratic Alliance proposes the following budget cuts. In order to address the public sector wage bill, the DA proposes freezing the wages of public servants not covered by occupational-specific dispensation, including the likes of head office managers and supervisors, over the 3-year MTEF period. This would save 140 billion rands. In addition, the government can save another 60 billion rands over the medium term by reducing the number of millionaire managers in the civil service. 18 million rand can be saved by freezing the new development bank funding over the medium term. 1 billion rand can be saved by reducing fruitless and wasteful expenditure in government entities over the MTEF. 5.25 billion rand can be saved over the medium term by slashing VIP protection and security services for politicians. 4.5 billion rand can be saved by shutting down the National Youth Development Agency, which does very little for the youth, over the medium term. And 4.68 billion rand can be saved by cutting the budget for the NHI, which has so far been plagued by chronic underspending and mismanagement. 15 billion rand over the medium term can be saved through more efficient procurement and a focus on reducing irregular expenditure and corruption. 50 million rand can be saved from cancelling the Cuba donation. 8.2 billion rand can be saved by ministerial departments and others through catering, accommodation, and entertainment. And additional expenditure in the form of debt service costs from Eskom and SANRAL debt transfers can save 60 billion rand over the medium term. Through dismissing state-owned enterprise debt takeovers, the government can save another 60 billion rand over the medium term. And the DA will not support any expenditure that relates to the NHI. The DA will not support any expenditure that relates to South African tourism's proposed 1 billion rand sponsorship deal with Tottenham Hotspurs Football Club. The DA will not support any expenditure relating to the formation of the President's proposed Ministry of Electricity. The DA will not support any expenditure related to the government's announced state of disaster around Eskom. And the DA will not support any expenditure related to the formation of the President's proposed holding company for SOEs. The DA will soon introduce a responsible spending bill that is designed to prioritize responsible and optimal expenditure and reduce overall government debt. At this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Bridget Masango to discuss how the DA will support vulnerable South Africans.
Thanks, Ashor. Good morning. The economic situation in South Africa has consistently had a disproportionate impact on low-income and marginalized individuals, with the COVID-19 pandemic and prolonged lockdowns exacerbating this trend. The meager post-pandemic economic recovery has been inadequate in alleviating the economic struggles faced by these groups. These difficulties are further compounded by external economic instability and domestic policies that impede economic participation and drive up the cost of living. These factors have collectively resulted in a severe cost of living crisis for vulnerable South Africans. With the savings realized from the DA's targeted spending, savings, and the implementation of the DA's policy framework targeted at uplifting the poor, the DA commits to protecting inflationary increases in social grants. The DA is in favor of providing conditional direct income support for the most vulnerable in our society, as it provides an economic floor and channels funds into the hands of consumers who are best placed to decide where to spend it. This makes for an efficient distribution of resources relative to a coupon or the current grant system, as the market makes more efficient allocative decisions than the government. The feasibility of funding a basic income grant is contingent upon a substantial and sustained increase in the economic growth. The DA's emphasis on the need to stimulate the economic growth dividend is informed by the proven metric that growth based on the principles of an enterprising economy generates ample employment opportunities, promotes investment and capital formation, and it improves revenue collection. Prioritizing economic growth is therefore the fundamental step towards uplifting South Africans out of absolute poverty, providing support for the unemployed, and initiating the formation of human and physical capital. This can be achieved through the adoption of implementation of a market-oriented policy framework by the Democratic Alliance, including increased infrastructure investment, expansion of labor market participation, and crucial economic reforms that bolster private sector involvement. These measures are crucial to mitigate the adverse impact of fiscal sustainability and address the constraints posed by a limited fiscal position. The Democratic Alliance can budget for the introduction of a conditional universal basic income grant at 585 Rand per month for adults without formal employment between the ages of 19 and 59, of which the cost is estimated at 157 billion Rand per year. The grant would be made available on the understanding that it would only be provided when revenue generated from the GDP growth is available, as would be the case given the implementation of the DA's policy framework. The South African economy is beset by one of the most onerous tax regimes in the world. The government's relentless imposition of levies on all forms of income, consumption, and property ownership, coupled with the mismanagement of the resources through waste, corruption, and embezzlement, has led to a severe deterioration of public confidence. Therefore, we shall not endorse the implementation of any additional tax or increment in tax rates, as an increase in these figures would impede economic growth and discourage investment, ultimately hindering the nation's recovery from the current cost of living crisis. The DA will accordingly not support a tax increase of any kind to fund government initiatives such as the National Health Insurance, the cost of which is expected to be hundreds of billions of rands. By managing the public finances more efficiently, the tax relief for hard-pressed consumers can be implemented. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. I would also like to say that the DA has proposed cutting VAT off a number of items in the food basket, and those items include bone-in chicken, beef, tinned beans, wheat flour, margarine, peanut butter, baby food, tea, coffee, and soup powder. We believe that reducing the cost of food that people will enable people to put more protein onto their tables and alleviate the deepening levels of poverty. Corruption in our economy impedes the efficient allocation of resources and impedes the functioning of market mechanisms. This can lead to a distorted allocation of resources and impede economic growth. The negative impact of corruption on economic performance can also have a broader societal impact, limiting opportunities for citizens and perpetuating poverty. The government's proclaimed commitment to bolster institutes responsible for combating crime, such as the National Prosecuting Authority, the Special Investigating Unit, and the Financial Intelligence Center, has yet to be fully realized in terms of financial allocation. Despite the ongoing state capture crisis and the critical role these institutions play in addressing corruption and other specialized and organized crimes, the 2022 February budget, much like previous budgets, has not provided significant relief to these perennially underfunded agencies. According to the NPA, the limited additional funding allocated to it will not be sufficient to effectively bring all those involved in state capture to justice. The NPA's budget for the 23-24 financial year is only 4.8 billion rand and a mere 5 billion rand for the following year. Even with an additional 1.1 billion allocated over the next 3 years, the NPA will still be operating at a significant disadvantage. The 2023 budget presents an opportunity for the government to rectify this issue. The DA is able to allocate an additional 1.8 billion to the NPA. The Financial Action Task Force had given South Africa until October 2022 to implement the necessary measures to avoid being placed on the grey list. This required cooperation between financial institutions and security authorities. Given government's inability to respond effectively, a grey listing is likely. Being added to the grey list would lead to increased difficulties for countries to conduct business with South Africa, as well as subjecting local companies to additional regulatory scrutiny. As a result, South African clients will be subject to enhanced due diligence, including more frequent and in-depth assessments for anti-money laundering and combating of terrorist financing risks. This will result in increased costs for South African businesses and individuals that engage in international trade and have financial accounts abroad. The occurrence of this event would signify to the global economy that South Africa lacks the capability and determination to effectively address systemic organized crime and high-level corruption. To exit the grey list as quickly as possible, South Africa must demonstrate its ability to hold financial criminals to account. In conclusion, our economy is in serious trouble, a direct result of government's failed economic policies. In particular, its failed model for black economic empowerment, its attempt to place a dysfunctional state at the center of our economy, and its disastrous cadre deployment policy. The most vulnerable South Africans are paying the price for this failure as the cost of living spirals upward and drives more and more households into poverty. It is possible to change the direction of our economic trajectory if we make the right choices, and the window of that opportunity is wide open. We need to act while we still can. Thanks.
Thanks, Dion. Thanks, colleagues. Colleagues from the media, if you've got any questions, now is the time for questions. Just during the normal protocol, introduce yourself and do questions. And by indication of hands, we've got all the time for Ash, Ma'am Bridget, and Dion to take questions. So if you've got a follow-up, maybe just try to combine them in the first question so that when we can move to other people. Yeah, Lindsay.
Yes, thank you. Linda Ensel, Business Day. Just two questions. When you say no tax increases, are you also saying no inflation-linked increase in the tax brackets? So actually tax will decrease. And then secondly, how realistic is it to link the payment of the big to revenues? Because that means it can be there and it can be taken away, which isn't going to go down very well with the recipients. Thanks.
Cool. Sure, I'll come back to you, Ati. Yeah,
Just following on the question that Linda asked, just how viable is this plan with regards to the basic income grant? You say that it's about 585 rand that you propose to be given to recipients, which would cost about 157 billion rand a year. Just how viable is that, given that already about 18 million people receive social grants or some sort of social grants, and given the poor state of the economy, it is expected that this could reach about 20 million by 2025 by marginal estimates. So just how viable is that plan? I know it's linked to the economic growth, but what we're working with at the moment is less than, I think, 1% of economic growth and very poor GDP rate. So how do you plan on implementing this? Thank you.
So just go ahead and then we'll finish off with that.
Lula Mamaja, SABC. You're saying that you're not in support of the Minister of Electricity. What's your reason behind that? Secondly, on the debt levels, have you done any study maybe to compare whether South Africa is standing on debt levels compared to emerging countries or countries that are at the same level as South Africa? Because if you're looking at the US debt levels, they are saying that there's a problem because its debt level exceeds $31 trillion in 2022, which is less than their GDP. So when you compare South Africa, where does it stand? Thanks.
Shall I kick off?
There's a last one. Yeah, we'll just do them as a pitch.
Thank you. Atim Tana from Newsroom Africa. Given the fact that the Democratic Alliance annually presents the alternative budget before the Minister of Finance's budget speech, and for an ordinary South African that's listening to this alternative, how effective are some of these proposals insofar as implementation as members of Parliament sitting in committees that play an oversight role, subsequently as to how budget is spent in the country? Thanks.
Cool, thanks. Do you want to kick off and then?
Yes, I'll kick off and then everybody can assist me. In terms of the tax increases, you're talking about fiscal drag for inflation. We know inflation is marching upward, so that is quite a huge problem. We do believe that there is space for no tax increases. And the reason...
No inflation...
We believe it is possible, yes. We do believe it is possible. If you look at how the economy is structured, and if you look at the amount of money that is wasted in it, we do believe that if you did not adjust the tax rate for inflation, because it's pay as you earn basically that you're looking at, that it's hitting individual people, that you can in fact do that. We also have difficulty over years to see how government actually does adjust that. It always says that it's lagging behind, which is probably so. We believe that it can lag behind some more. Because if you implement effective economic growth, you can in fact grow our economy and you can get more revenue. It is possible. So that is our position. We believe that South African households are struggling enough. They're already paying too much tax. And therefore we believe that it is necessary and doable to hold on to tax at the specific rate. On the basic income grant, yes, we've said it's conditional. And yes, you have to look at carefully to make sure that people don't have an expectation that if you give a grant and then you take the grant away, you cannot do that. Once you've given a grant, you cannot take it away. Our view is quite simply this, that it is possible within the size of our economy, because South Africa is not a poor country. We are doing poorly economically because we have poor economic policy, but we are not a poor country. So we do believe that it's possible, if you implement reform in the economy, that our economy will grow, which means that more people will go into employment. You will have then less people that will be needy for that grant. At the moment, what we've said is that it would be for unemployed South Africans, not for everybody. It would be conditional. But over time, it would be possible to make it available to everybody on a rising tide. But where we are currently right now, 585 Rand a month is in fact doable, because that's already what government is doing. So we do believe it's possible, and we do think we need to move into that direction. On the Minister of Electricity, we think it's a really bad idea. And the reason for that, because you already have a Minister for Energy and you already have a bloated cabinet. What we need is structural reforms in Eskom. The reason why government needs to transfer the money from the Eskom's balance sheet onto the national balance sheet is because international investors will not give Eskom more money for one simple reason. Eskom is not viable. So what government wants to do is to take the money off the balance sheet, put it onto the national balance sheet, and then there's no incentive for Eskom to become more efficient. So we think it's a really bad idea. Starting up another ministry isn't going to make any difference. The president says that we'll put this minister in the presidency and they will do some things. Now the question is, what things will this person do that cannot be done otherwise? We know that Eskom has massive corruption and structural problems, and the only way you can fix it is to unbundle it. And that's the reality. So having a Minister of Electricity, which will cost a fortune for a ministry, will not fix the problem. It's just kicking a broken can down the road. And then on debt levels, I'll ask Ashor to assist me here, but it is so that we are not the USA and we are not the UK, and their levels of debt are high. But their economies, if you look at the employment rate in the United States, they don't have a problem with it. So that is the problem. Our South African economy isn't growing. So if you're not growing and you're getting more debt, it means that you've got an interest to pay, but you eventually don't have enough money to pay for that interest. Or if you do pay the interest, you've got to crowd out other services that must be provided. That's the danger. Because if our economy does not grow, we are not going to be able to pay for interest and services. And that's an enormously big problem. We are in fact doing some numbers to see at what point we might get into very significant trouble. We already are in trouble, but it's not yet very significant. And then on the annual budget that we do, yes, we do very much, as you can see, do a comprehensive amount of work thinking about how we can better manage the South African economy and how we can grow it. I do actually meet with the Minister of Finance on a reasonably regular basis, and we do talk about South Africa's problems. We do talk about how we can grow our economy, and we do talk about those things, and I do believe that he does listen. Implementation is a different story, but the fact is that there is communication, and that's good. So we both understand what the problems are. We might just have a difference of view on how to actually fix the problem. So we do have that relationship, and that I think is very conducive for South Africa's growth. In terms of Parliament, Ashor is on the Appropriations Committee that looks at spending, and I'm on finance, as you know, and there is a law that says you can adjust the budget. You can do that, and every year we do propose changes. We do not get them passed. What we need to do is get more votes so that we can do that. And in the future, as things change, we might very well see that we will be strong enough, or an opposition in South Africa will be strong enough at some point to be able to make those changes. And I think that will be a furtherance of our democracy over time. For now, government never changes anything, and I think that's quite a tragedy, because they should actually be listening carefully, because we do have very constructive ideas to bring, and that's what we are, a very constructive and sensible opposition. My colleagues can add on from there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think we pick up where you left off on the last point about the influence that we have, the question from Newsroom Africa. So, in the direct relationship with the finance minister, as Dion said, we at least are able to have conversations. But when you get into the parliamentary committees, and I'm sure many of you have live streamed or watched the proceedings, the majoritarian approach of the governing party completely distorts our ability to actually get any reasonable sense of any changes through. So individual members might agree with you and say, yes, X, Y, Z, but then the party line matter comes into play. And so every year when we table budget amendments at the Appropriations Committee, they get voted down. And some might say it's a Frigg exercise, but the reality is it's provided for in the Constitution and in law, and it requires some political maturity. The most the Appropriations Committee has ever adjusted was a single R1 million in the last, since the Act was passed in 2010. One adjustment was made for R1 million. So not a lot. In the past, we've proposed things like cutting VIP protection for politicians, and they've just used the majority to shut it down, for example. With regards to government debt, the question from the SABC, the world is an unfair place. The United States operates the reserve currency of the world. So they can print money knowing that there'll be demand for dollars. And so they can issue more government bonds and issue more government debt, knowing that their currency is used to trade oil, major commodities, etc., etc. We are not the global reserve currency. We don't have that luxury, don't have that privilege. So we have to operate where we are in the world, and we are a middle-income economy that is relatively open, that faces quite severe headwinds both internally and internationally. And in that environment, our debt levels are unsustainable, and our economic policies has caused us to be downgraded to junk by credit ratings agencies. And as a consequence of that, if we don't get the debt situation under control, much like we've seen with other emerging income peers like Argentina and elsewhere, you will either end up with debt defaults because you can't fund the paying of your debts, or you will be placed under some kind of IMF rescue package which undermines your sovereignty and your ability to follow a policy direction that improves your country. And those are the two serious risks with what you need to do. Because the IMF and other major global institutions try to make your expenditure fit your revenue. That is their objective when they come in, because you miss debt payments on the international markets. And so those things pose very serious risks. And we've seen this with other middle-income countries and lower-income countries. And we need to be very, very aware of both those risks. The risk of default, if we get to 100% of GDP, and we're well into the 70s now, then grows increasingly high. And as I said in my remarks, 20 cents for every rand that the government gets in revenue goes to pay debt. It is the single largest line item. We spend more on debt than we do on education, or in healthcare, or in policing and social development and sports, arts and culture and recreation combined, for example. So we need to look at this debt situation very, very, very seriously and understand that it's now beginning to crowd out our ability to actually deliver basic public services. It's crowding out our ability to increase the number of nurses that we have relative to the population size, or to have a proper police to population ratio as well. And these things are going to be getting worse unless the debt situation is resolved. And that's going to require the government to make some, and what I view as politically easy choices: cut your VIP protection, don't deal with vanity projects, etc., but it seems to be politically hard for the ANC. Thanks.
Okay, 2 follow-ups. Okay, let's take the questions and then you guys can do the follow-up.
Sorry, Linda, again. There seems to be a disjuncture between your anticipation of economic growth on the basis of your policies, which will take some time to evolve, and your immediate proposals for no tax cuts and the basic income grant. What do you say about that disjuncture in the time? Thank you.
Let's take them all at once. Dominic, there's a question at the back.
Francois Williams from Netwerk 24. Just on the energy crisis, you want to privatize Eskom, or at least the generating assets, but where are you going to find a private company who want to buy it, seeing the state it is in? And then the solar rebate of that can 480 megawatts moderately that you expect to get out of it. Don't you think the 4 billion could be spent a bit better in the short term to have load shedding curtailed quicker?
Just a quick one from me. What debt levels would you be comfortable as the DA government?
Do you want to start, Ashor?
Let's take Bianca first.
Okay. In terms of the timing, yes, what we do is on our alternative budget, we say, well, if we did these economic reforms, you would then find the economy would lift and then you'd have more revenue. We have, in fact, done the numbers. So what we sit down and do is look through all the numbers and say, if we cut this type of expenditure, etc., what would it look like? And that discounts any lift in the economy in the immediate term. So we do believe that there's sufficient fund available if you don't spend on the areas that are so hugely inefficient. Okay. So we think that's how you would manage the time frame. On the energy crisis, it is a good question. Who would invest in Eskom? But I think the key thing is this. If there is a real political will and that the economy and the market believes that there is in fact a will to fix this and clean up the mess, there is plenty of money available. Absolutely no doubt about that. You have entities from across the world that are saying, we would love to provide energy for South Africa because it is a massive market and it also has access to the rest of Africa. But they do not come because the regulation doesn't permit it. So we believe that if the regulation was in the right place and investors actually believed it, they would in fact come, because it is the next big thing. Green energy is a massive thing into the future, and South Africa is perfectly positioned for that. And then on the rebate, we believe that people are battling, small businesses battling, they cannot operate, they're off 4 times a day sometimes, and individuals. So we believe it is important to give those rebates now, because that means that at least a small business will be able to operate a little bit more than it can currently, and households can have a little bit more relief. Because the knock-on effect, if a child, for example, can't do their homework at night because the lights are off, for example, that impacts. We don't even know the impact, what's going to happen over time. So we believe that It's not a choice that needs to be made, like, oh, I'll rather spend the money on diesel, for example. There is plenty of money available for diesel if there was the will to actually make it available appropriately. I will give Ashor the question on the debt levels, if you'd like to take that.
Thanks, Dion. So, when you look at government debts, the key thing to note is that since 2009, there hasn't been a single year where debt to GDP has stabilized. And every single year since 2009, National Treasury has missed its targets on stabilizing debt to GDP. Now, granted, we had COVID, which caused a major amount of borrowing and an escalation of that. But even before that, the trend was for a massive upwards trajectory. And so the first objective must be to stabilize debt to GDP within the medium term, 3 years. To get it into the mid-70s, so it actually does not get into the 80s and 90s where you're then hitting very serious trouble. So over a 3-year term, you want to stabilize your debt to GDP ratio in the 70s. And then over the following MTEF, you want to start bringing it down. And over a period of 10 years, ideally, we should get it down into the 50s. I think it would be unrealistic to go back to the good days when you had a debt to GDP ratio of 27% back in the mid-2000s. We've seen globally that most countries now are tolerating, and markets are tolerating, much higher debt to GDP ratios. And I think that 50% would probably be a good place in which we can stabilize our debt to GDP over time and give us fiscal space when we do need to do counter-cyclical interventions when there are downturns without having to go into major crises every time. So that would be the ideal place to get to over a period of 10 years.
Cool. Thanks very much, colleagues, for coming through. Both Dion and Ashor will be available in the lead up to the budget speech.
I can give it to you.
Don't forget your recorder. The last time you did.
Thanks for watching. Like and follow our page on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that notification bell. Tell us what you think in the comment section. And please, like and share our videos with your friends and family. Join the DA. Join the fight to save South Africa.